Please welcome Rania Khalaf, Chief Information and Data Officer, INARA. Ritu Raman, Assistant Professor of Mechanical Engineering, MIT. And moderator Alexander Dale, Director of Global Challenges, MIT Solve.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to the stage. It's wonderful to be able to talk with both of you. You are both here, and you're both doing really interesting pieces with biotech. And so I want to start our conversation off with a little bit of what you're doing with some of these physical materials. So, Rania, starting with you, you come from an AI background, but you're now using it to make better seeds. Can you tell us a little bit about what seeds can mean for climate and how AI helps us make better ones?
Sure. Hi. If you think about the problems of our time now, I really think we're looking at food, climate, and health, the three, and food plays a really central role. So if you think about greenhouse gas emissions, food and agriculture account for about 24%. And if you look at the rate at which the population of the world is growing, we just don't have enough land and water to grow the food that we need to feed everybody. So at Inari, we are using multiplex gene editing and AI to figure out where and how we can edit corn, soy, and wheat so that they create more food and use less water and resources.
Perfect. And so you've got both the AI and the CRISPR piece. You've got all the different trends here in Kendall Square all blended together. Ritu, at MIT, you're working with adaptive living tissues, I think is the way. Can you tell us what those are and give us a specific example of what that might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a mechanical engineer by training, so generally when we think of mechanical engineers, we say, okay, you know, they're building machines, trains, planes, that sort of thing. But usually they're building with things like metals and ceramics and polymers. And what we're trying to do is figure out a way that we can start building with living tissues like cells and organs because they can sense and adapt to their surroundings in real time. So a specific example of something we're working on is developing actuators, so anything that generates force and produces motion, which a lot of machines and robots need. We use living muscle cells to make actuators. And the nice thing about them is that they're very energy efficient. They use sugar as an energy source. They can exercise and get stronger. They can heal from damage.
That's super cool. Give us an application that you're focused on right now.
Yeah, so a lot of our work kind of splits between robotics and medicine. So on the robotic side, we make robots that swim, walk, pump, grip, using muscle to do that and show that they can adapt to their environments. And then because we're making tissues, often with like mouse or human cells, which are really good models of our own bodies, we can use them to understand more about our own response to exercise or our response to different sorts of diseases that might limit our mobility. So we have applications in both those spaces.
Really, really neat. Both of you are doing these very technical pieces with very tricky systems. You're generating some information on how to do this. You're building some complicated physical systems. I want to talk a little bit about how we move those from a lab scale or an information scale to a set of physical objects, and then we should talk about how we get it to scale. So, Rania, when you want to take this set of information, use CRISPR to make better seeds, what are some of the limitations on getting those seeds to a bunch of farmers or a bunch of different places, or one of the frustrations in trying to develop them?
I think you hit on a very interesting point, which is this combination of the bits and bytes, so the computational world and its intersection with the biological world. And these things go at different rates and speeds. So I come from a pure tech background, and there, you know, you're delivering code multiple times a day, continuous delivery. And at Inari, when I joined, you realize these plants, they take several weeks to grow. It takes 5 to 10 years to make a product because you have to, it's great if you make one seed, but if you need to get to farmer scale, you need millions of seeds. And we have to really think about that interplay and making decisions early enough so that you can collect the data you need when the plant is still alive before it's harvested, and time all these cycles, as well as be able to translate the biological problem into a computational one, which is not obvious all the time, and probably, Ritu, you see a lot of that as well, right?
Do you want to talk about some of the biological problems and translating those back to computational problems and other spaces there too?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, our bodies are very, very complicated computers, right? So you have a motor control system in your head that's then distributed throughout your spinal cord and is telling you, reach over there and pick something up is a very computationally difficult problem. So figuring out how to map that circuitry and then build it up from scratch is incredibly technically challenging and requires you to understand the architecture first. And so there's a lot of back and forth that happens.
Great. So you have these different machines. You're going to put muscle cells so that my computer or my other pieces can move around and use muscles to do things. I'm going to feed them with sugar. Great. What are the steps in between getting that from your lab into the hands of some students at MIT to try it out, and then from there to people across Cambridge being able to use it?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked because I think we're both in a time but also a physical place that is really amenable to doing that sort of thing, right? Like MIT is very focused on the ethos of mens et manus, so having your hands and your mind being involved in the thing you're doing, and there's a strong maker community. So we have a new, so in my lab, we train people for several months and usually years to be able to make muscles and use them. But we also run workshops at the biomaker space that started a couple years ago and a new biomanufacturing space that we're starting in the next year or so, where people get hands-on experience on building with cells and using tissues with their hands.
Very cool. Rania, coming back to on the same piece, you've talked about how you work with AI, now you're in this physical space. How do you see this interplay on people who want to do good things and want to use some of these AI tools? Where do you see the intersection with those with all these different problems that you mentioned and the ways that AI can help us solve these very physical problems?
It's been interesting. A lot of the money being pumped into AI right now is going very much into consumer tech, faster email, make me more efficient, more effective. But a lot of the talent today wants to work on more impactful problems. A lot of the people in this room probably also want to, spend their energy maybe not on having eyeballs longer on a scrolling page. So this is where thinking about how data and AI can really help, in my case, to solve these big problems. The opportunity is really massive. It takes some time and patience because we are at the intersection of disciplines, and that is never easy, right? Because you have a language barrier, there's a way of thinking barrier, so you really have to interleave these disciplines. But I'm excited to see more things like the Schwarzman College of Computing and what's happening at BU as well, where they're creating these schools that are multidisciplinary from the get-go, so you don't have to force yourself to be computing or biology, you can be computing and. Because for us, let me give you an example, the terminology is all different, so we have to spend time nearly on a lexicon, and it takes about 6 months for a AI person that's not coming from ag biotech to get proficient enough to solve real problems. So the word vector, for me, a vector, or it's like in physics, right?
It's a data structure.
It's a data
set of numbers,
structure,
yeah.
right? In biology, it's a biological material that you use to infect the cell, right? So it's the same word, but it means a different thing. Architecture for us is the system architecture, the database talks to a microservice, whatever. And for the agronomists, the architecture is the height of the plant, the angle of the leaf. It's just the same words, they mean a different thing. So.
Do you see the same piece? Because you're obviously also sitting at the intersection of
Yes.
several different fields when you're recruiting students, when you're trying to publish, or
Always, all the time. Both in recruiting and publishing, I'm glad you brought both of those up because we're housed in a mechanical engineering department, which is great. We bring people from a lot of different backgrounds, but at the end of the day, if you're making a machine that's built with living cells, you either need to know a lot of biology, well, you both need to know a lot of biology, how to work with cells, but also how to machine a system and put it together and figure out how force is going to translate into motion. And nobody comes in with both those backgrounds. You're either a biologist or a mechanical engineer, so everybody has to do a ton of work, months of work, sometimes years to get up to speed, both, verbally and also technically.
Yep.
And then when you're publishing, it's all about stakeholders, talking to different people in ways that kind of highlight what they value. Even if your system might have many different applications, when you're talking to a certain audience, you want to really focus on what they care about.
Sure. I want to pull us back to a larger geographic lens. We've talked about this amazing stuff that's happening around Kendall, lots of different ways, and around Cambridge. I'm struck always by the sci-fi author William Gibson's quote that the future is already here, but it's not equally distributed. So I want to think about what it means to take some of these knowledge pieces, whether that's how to develop other seeds or the seeds themselves, adaptive living tissues, and the availability of some of those, and think about how we bring those to other parts of the world that maybe have less capacity, less piles of labs all in the same space, and wonder about how either of you are thinking about some of those different challenges. Certainly for things like climate, we know that we are going to need good seeds everywhere in the world. And I think there's some data limitations on how we even start to produce those from an AI perspective now. Is that?
So if you think about, in the opening session, I forget the name of the speaker. She was saying health is how humans experience climate change.
Vanessa Carey, yes.
I probably butchered that, but to that effect. And for me, I think also, again, food is the other. I think it's a bit of a triangle. And what we see is a lot of the push in computation and a lot of the money and the investment has really been in consumer because there's been a lot of investment there and activity, and it's faster. But we see healthcare came fast behind, but really because a lot of the regulation, and there was a big push to normalize healthcare data, to standardize it, to share it. The companies themselves were not going to share it, right? And in food, I feel like there's a big opportunity for data standardization and data sharing, which doesn't really yet exist and needs some incentives and some investments. And yesterday we were talking with one of the solvers, Taita, about the greenhouses they're putting in Africa that have IoT and collect data, and they were thinking about, can that data be part of the assets of the farmer, or can it be part of how they pay? So thinking more creatively about how to unlock data from around the world and how to be able to unlock the access to this information. The lovely thing about AI generally is it's been a big open source community focused movement. So I'm excited to see a lot more applications of data and AI and a lot more investment really from the foundations and data all the way up to the models and their applications.
How much do you think the data exists and is poorly structured, and how much does the data not exist? If we want to do seeds for Kenya, take that example, do we have the information on crop systems to do that?
So there's a lot of data on what we think of as the right side of the equation, so on fields and so on. There's been a lot of applications trying to detect disease or fly drones over fields. It's not really standardized, but at least it more or less exists, so you can collect it reasonably fast. What's very hard for the kind of work that Inari is doing is the data on the genetics and the genome to the genotype to phenotype association. So what happens to the plant, which gene is responsible for how the plant behaves. That data is very, very sparse and is not really available openly, right? And the other part in plants that's hard is that what's called the assays. So the experiments to generate data at scale of the kind of data you need to build these models is still very early in its application. So you really need this, people are calling it lab in the loop. So you really need this interplay between the experiment that generates the data and the AI model, because the models really generate hypotheses. And if you can't test the model tells you, modify that gene to get more yield, if you don't have a way to test it quickly and you have to wait several years to grow these seeds and test them in multiple locations, it's very inefficient. So you need new kinds of ways to test earlier and know if the thing is working.
So Ritu, I want to come to you on a different side. So we're talking about physical data on that side. I want to ask about who gets to be part of some of these systems as well. I know you've done a bunch of work on making STEM more accessible in different parts of the world. How do you see that connected to some of your work on adaptive living tissues and some of these other machines, and trying to broaden who gets to be part of these solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the opportunity, but also problem with what we do, right, is that we are in a place of great privilege here in Kendall, and the things we do are very resource intensive, very expensive, and require a ton of infrastructure. One of the nice things, I think, is starting to see Kendall move past healthcare into more things like food and robotics and other things where, the price point where people are willing to pay or are forced to pay are much lower. And so we're forced to be able to make things in more efficient ways at scale. And I think the first part of getting technologies more accessible is making sure we're kind of broadening the application spaces. But just there's a step beyond, can I use the technology, and then also can I make it and contribute to it and have the literacy to engage in this way. And I think part of that will be not only international, but also thinking about in rural parts of the US, making sure we have ways to make sure that people feel that they understand what's happening, they have the words to use and describe it and to challenge it in some way, and to give as many people hands-on experiences with biomaking as possible.
I love that. Are there any points of final advices to people who are sitting at that privileged point with these very deep technical systems, whether it's computational or physical, that you would give to innovators who are trying to do this work? And coming from a more startup space without quite as much of that infrastructure in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really nice things I think about Solve, and probably everyone who's here, is you're sort of focused on a problem, and less, I think something that I really struggle to get across, at least to a lot of students at MIT, is they're focused on like degrees and milestones, right, and things that make sense of like, I will define a path and then somehow that will have positive impact. And I think for anybody else, I would say like picking a problem that's really hard and that matters to you is more important than the specific path you take to get there. So that's mostly my advice there.
Love that. Rania?
I think I love what you said about don't be stuck to the path, but focus on the mission that you have. I think for me it's just passions for hard problems. These hard problems, the solutions are not really known, and that's by design. They will be difficult, but the technology is only a small part of the solution, right? So even in AI, they say like the model is 10% of the work, but we see that also even if you build a full system, there's getting it to market, there's changing the hearts and minds and the ways that the people work who will use your system, and there's the ability to take it to scale. So all these things, if your area is regulated, that also has to play a factor. So to make impactful change, it's sometimes hard, but it's a long journey, so be patient.
Thank you. So yeah, technology is only a piece of the piece, but you have to be attached to the problem. Love those pieces. Thank you for the discussion on how we take these complicated systems and think about how we make them bigger. Thank you so much.
Thank you.